Although it might seem odd today, for more than a decade, most of the major air arms on both sides of the Iron Curtain seriously investigated the procurement of jet powered seaplane fighters. These are some of the more interesting and innovative aircraft of the Cold War, and objectively would have been at least somewhat effective had they reached operational status. Although it was only the Royal Navy and the US Navy that got their projects off the drawing board, serious studies were also conducted in both France and the Soviet Union. I'll cover them here too. I'm going to stick to fighters and interceptors though, rather than bombers, as that's a whole other topic and probably needs to include ground effect vehicles as well as traditional seaplanes. Seaplane fighters were not a new idea. All of the major navies deployed biplane float planes during the Great War, initially as a defense against attack from airships and later from heavier than air bombers. As the performance differential increased between land and carrier based fighters and float planes, the type nearly became extinct. The exception was in the Imperial Japanese Navy, which deployed over 300 Nakajima A6M2Ns and 89 Kawanishi Kyofu to defend remote outposts. These brought useful advantages over a land based fighter in a mobile campaign over the Pacific, where there were many islands but few prepared strips. Given a sheltered stretch of water and some basic maintenance facilities, the seaplane fighter brought useful defensive and scouting capabilities. In Britain, the top echelons of the aircraft industry were captivated by the new jet engine. Among the many thoughts on how to use this technology, the management of the Saunders company recognized its potential to give a water-based fighter enough performance to defeat land-based piston engine types. At the time, the assumption was that the Japanese were unlikely to develop their own jets anytime soon. The jet engine also made the task of designing such an aircraft rather easier, as the absence of a propeller removed the need for a high thrust line and the associated need for a deep, draggy hull. In turn, that would also reduce weight. Less power and fuel would therefore be needed in a jet-powered water-based fighter. In July 1943, Saro had a conversation to this end with the Ministry of Aircraft Production. This resulted in a preliminary design sketch being made, which was presented to MAP in December 1943. The intention was to build a turbojet-powered flying boat for operation in coastal waters, mainly because Saro didn't know how to design an open seas aircraft. MAP liked what they saw and they allocated £305,000 to the project. That's about £17.5 million or $21.5 million in 2024 money. The most difficult part of the design, initially at least, was the hull form. A very slender planing surface was initially considered in an attempt to reduce aerodynamic and hydrodynamic drag, but this idea was rejected as it provided insufficient horizontal stability and a more traditional form was used, with the two engines mounted side by side in the hull. Those engines were amongst the new aircraft's most innovative features. The Meteor and Vampire were both powered by centrifugal flow engines. These were easier to make and certainly easier to get high power outputs from in the early days of the technology. The Saro fighter didn't use these large engines. Instead, it was designed around an innovative axial flow engine type from the Metropolitan Vickers Company called the F-24 Beryl. The Beryl was small in diameter and thus could be fitted in the hull without the beam growing too much. Their packaging was so efficient that a man could stand and work in the hull between the engines in the eventual aircraft. Air was fed into them via a large single intake, equipped with an extendable snout 10 inches long. The intention was to link this to the float retraction mechanism so that it would reduce the chances of spray entering the intake on takeoff and landing. But when the system was eventually trialled on the third prototype, it proved unnecessary. A dorsal intake concept was also considered but rejected. Each engine had its own exhaust behind the wing roots, towed out 5 degrees to keep the hull clear of the jet exhaust. That hull form was V-shaped, tapering to a knife edge where the water rudder was situated. It was all metal, shaped around the engines. Armament was in the form of four 20mm cannons with 760 rounds total, mounted on the nose decking above the air intake. The cannons were aimed via a gyro gun sight. The cockpit glass had gradations on it to help the pilot aim rockets if we were using those. Wings were relatively fine for speed. They had flaps, ailerons, and dive brakes, and also contained two fuel tanks per side, containing 424 imperial gallons total, as well as the retractable wing floats. One hardpoint for stores was provided on each inner wing structure. At the back, the tail is high-mounted to clear both the jet blast and the spray. The remarkable thing about all of this is how conventional it is. For all intents and purposes, the Saro float fighter is just a normal early jet, but with floats instead of wheels. It was also sophisticated in some other respects, though. The cockpit was pressurized, and it had an electrically operated bubble canopy. This single-piece unit would be replaced later on as it came off in flight, which wasn't ideal. It was replaced by a much stronger three-piece unit, but at the expense of all-round visibility. Cabin heating came from drawing air from the engine compressors. Cooling was achieved by drawing air from the intake. The automatic climate control system activated above 9,000 feet. The pilot sat in a Martin Baker ejection seat, making this the first aircraft to be fitted with one. There was also provision for a G-suit. All of this is very sophisticated stuff for the middle 1940s. Steel armor protected the pilot. Because the fighter had retractable wing floats, there were position lights for these in the same position in the cockpit you would find landing gear position lights in a land-based aircraft. There was a toggle for connecting the water rudder to the air rudder when you were taxiing, and a push-pull knob for the semi-automatic mooring system. That was a simple but effective system. To use it, the pilot steered between two marker buoys, which were connected by a cable. There was a hook on the keel at the front, just below the waterline. When the aircraft taxied over the cable, it engaged it and could then be dragged off to a pontoon or onto a dock. All up, the package weighed 16,000 pounds, which was about 2,500 pounds more than the Meteor F1. It was 50 feet long with a 46-foot wingspan. Wing loading was about 38.5 pounds per square foot, which was quite reasonable. A Meteor came in at 44. General aerodynamics and handling were good, and Saro took great efforts to make the finish very high. It was an acrobatic aircraft, as it would demonstrate at numerous air shows in the coming years. As it was a prototype, the aircraft didn't receive an official name. Its internal designation was SR-A/1, but most people called it the Squirt. 3 flying prototypes were ordered in May 1944, but at the end of the war and resultant reduction in urgency and slowdown in engine development meant that the first of them wasn't ready until the spring of 1947. Saunders Roe also concentrated most of their post-war efforts on development of the Princess flying boat for the civilian market. The Squirt took its first flight on the 16th of July 1947 and proved to be generally pretty decent. Some lateral instability was tuned out by adding a small fairing at the junction of the fin and the tailplane. A tendency to roll was cured by altering the shape of the rudder's trailing edge. These are just the normal developmental fiddlings that go on in the early life of a prototype. On its 5th flight, the Squirt made 400-mile-an-hour runs past a delegation from the RAF, Fleet Air Arm, and numerous other departments and press organizations. The aircraft's short takeoff capabilities were also demonstrated. It turned out that retracting the wing floats as soon as the aircraft was traveling fast enough to be laterally stable reduced the takeoff run by minimizing drag. Takeoff took 26 seconds and the initial climb rate was 5,800 feet per minute. Although not as good as a Meteor F8, this was 20% better than a Vampire and 15% better than the US Grumman Panther carrier fighter that was then in development. Service ceiling was 43,000 feet. There is, however, a but, and in this case it relates to top speed, which was only 512 miles an hour. This fell well below the Meteor and was 80 miles per hour slower than the Panther. and on the 1st of October 1947, the F-86 Sabre had flown. With swept wings, this was an aircraft that could comfortably exceed 650 miles per hour with potential to push towards 700. Even with uprated barrels giving 3,850 pounds of force, the aerodynamics of the squirt were a significant impediment. Orders didn't materialise. The issue that the ministry faced with the squirt was that its intended role had dissipated. Its performance eclipsed any piston engine fighter, but jets were proliferating. Carrier jet fighters were also close to entering service, although in the fleet air arm that initially meant the underwhelming Supermarine Attacker, which, although it theoretically boasted a 590-mile-an-hour top speed, did not in fact give anything like that performance in practice. There seemed little prospect of an island-hopping campaign in the Pacific or anywhere else, and in any case the squirt didn't have particularly good range. Flight time was only 2.5 hours when using drop tanks and 1 hour and 3/4 without them. The aircraft did potentially offer a solution to the lack of adequate airstrips in many outposts of the Empire, but the issue in this regard was really the lack of an enemy who had aircraft at all. A Spitfire variant provided easily enough aerial firepower. A small order may well have been placed, but as soon as the war ended, it was clear that engines would also be a major issue. Metropolitan Vickers almost immediately reverted to their pre-war activities in electrical generation. Development of the Beryl passed to Armstrong Siddeley, who had very little interest in it. They had already started development of the axial flow Sapphire, which would ultimately power the Hawker Hunter. A Rolls-Royce Avon version of the design was also proposed around 1948, but that didn't progress anywhere. After 2 of the prototypes had crashed due to pilot error in 1949, Saunders Roe did propose a single-engine version powered by a single Sapphire, which had now run for the first time in late 1948, but installing that excellent engine would have taken a lot of time and a lot of money. The early days of the Korean War demonstrated the utility of a flying boat fighter able to operate from advanced bases. In the rush to rearm and refresh capabilities, there was some US interest in acquiring the squirt, but because there were no engines and redesign would take too long, those came to nothing as well. Fortunately, and unusually for a British experimental aircraft of the period, the sole surviving SRA-1 was stored until the 1980s, then restored at Duxford, and it's now displayed at the Solent Sky Museum in Southampton. Another more ambitious proposal for a boat fighter came from the other side of the Atlantic. Convair had started to investigate what they called blended hulls in 1946. The idea was that the aircraft would ride low in the water, with its wings contributing to buoyancy. This was Project Skate, and it resulted in at least 7 discrete proposals, starting in 1948. Project Skate is a topic all of its own, as Convair was studying tactical concepts as well as the aircraft themselves. The all-weather radar-equipped Interceptor concept is particularly interesting, as it sought to resolve the issues around heavy weight of avionics required in such an aircraft that at the time was believed to be stretching the ability of jet aircraft to come aboard ship. Skate 7 was a 2-place fighter with side-by-side accommodation. The radar operator sat to the right and slightly below the pilot. Like the Squirt, it was intended to operate from sheltered water in waves of 5 feet or less. The hull was therefore quite conventional, featuring a hull step, vents and chines intended to reduce the drag usually experienced with hull bottoms. There was a water rudder for taxiing. The huge wings had quite an aggressive 40-degree sweep. Total area was 960 square feet. They had leading-edge slats, trailing-edge power-operated metal ailerons and flaps. Like the Squirt, the tail was high but not quite a T. It was an all-flying type rather than the cable-operated system on the Saro fighter. Engines were a pair of the infamous experimental Westinghouse J40s, which will likely cause many of us to shudder and look to the heavens. Armament would have been 4 20mm cannons in the wing roots just outside of the engine intakes. All of this is very impressive, but contributed to significant weight. The most likely Skate configuration weighed more than twice as much as the Squirt at 39,000 pounds. In order to get to a sensible density and not sink immediately, it was 83 feet long with a span of 63.5 feet. Due to the expected performance of the J-40s, that mass was shifted by a total of 23,500 pounds of force when in afterburner. With those figures, you get an initial climb rate of a startling 22,000 feet per minute off a 21-second takeoff run. Wind tunnel trials suggested that top speed was aerodynamically limited to 713 miles an hour at sea level, or 639 at 35,000 feet. It could reach that altitude in 2.5 minutes. But of course, the J-40 was actually a total dog, and it gave 6,800 pounds at the most before it was cancelled. That would have reduced total power to 13,600 pounds of force and thus severely blunted the skate's performance. Various alternative configurations were experimented with before attention moved onto lighter aircraft and hydro skis as part of Project Beta. As it happens, Convair and the Navy were not the first to realise that supersonic fighters were incompatible with a conventional boat hull, however well it was designed. In 1947, just as the Squirt was making its first runs, a team at NACA designed, built, and tested a model of the Douglas 558 skyrocket equipped with 2 hydro skis. This was a pretty simple model consisting of a watertight version of the skyrocket, which was, to avoid any confusion, a land plane, fitted with skis that would retract flush to the bottom of the fuselage. Initial tests of the configuration suggested that with chines fitted to reduce drag, the takeoff and landing performance were very good. The Edo Corporation of Long Island was awarded a contract to develop a version of the Grumman Goose to test the hydro ski's performance. It apparently demonstrated that the single ski configuration halved the takeoff run compared to the basic hull. Essentially, the idea of the ski was to get around an issue that boat-hulled seaplanes encounter whenever the water isn't perfectly smooth. If the water is calm, then the transition from pushing through and displacing water to airborne and vice versa is accomplished in a gradual manner. Trim changes slowly over a small range of values, similar to when a land-based aircraft takes off or touches down. If the waves get to a height at which they can influence the aircraft's motion, then things change for the worse. When in the water, the aircraft experiences pitch variations as it plows through the waves. These exert forces and moments that reduce the effectiveness of controls, reduce speed, and potentially cause catastrophic changes in attitude. A hydro ski gets around this problem to an extent. As the plane accelerates across the surface, at some speed below the takeoff speed, the aircraft hops up onto the ski, which, being smaller and in the region of the aircraft's centre of gravity, is less likely to be affected by the forces and moments imparted by the waves. Similarly, on landing, the ski acts as a kind of shock absorber, allowing the aircraft to slow before the hull contacts the surface. Tests with the Goose would ultimately demonstrate that the practice was similar to the theory, resulting in shorter takeoff runs and smoother landings. Around the same time as the theory of hydroskis was being developed, Edo were also awarded a contract from the US Air Force named MX-940. The program was intended to produce a varied surface fighter capable of taking off from snow, ice, and water. The intention appears to have been to make a fighter able to operate in the Arctic, presumably against equivalent Soviet types and as a bomber interceptor. The US Air Force Project Office referred to the aircraft as a Panto-base fighter, or Arctic penetration fighter. It seemed sensible to integrate the two programs and thus fit the Arctic penetration fighter with a hydro ski. The resultant Edo 150 was a slender aircraft with a long, slim fuselage. It had swept wings. Because this was mid-1940s America, the wings had full-width leading-edge slats for low-speed control and trailing-edge ailerons and flaps. The tail was an unusual swept V. The aerodynamics of the design were tested by the NACA on models of an experimental test version of Edo 150 designated Edo 142. This was a much smaller, sub-8,000-pound aircraft that appears to have been intended just as a demonstrator, had it been built. NACA found that the takeoff and stability were fine. The tail required some adjustments to prevent excessive spray being thrown up, but otherwise the fuselage shape was good. As well as the single large hydro ski, it had fixed wingtip floats. When retracted, the central ski protruded only slightly below the fuselage line. Power came from two axial Allison J35s. These were the same engines used in the F-89 Scorpion. They gave 4,900 pounds of force dry and 7,350 with afterburners. The extra power over the earlier Squirt was needed, as all up the Edo 150 would have weighed 32,000 pounds. With afterburner, initial climb rate was estimated at over 15,000 feet per minute with a ceiling of 53,000 feet, and the maximum speed was just short of Mach 1 at 748 miles an hour. Unfortunately, funding was pulled, perhaps as the result of the Berlin airlift, and the project was abandoned. The idea of a hydro-ski fighter was, however, far from dead. Development of the ultimate example of the jet-powered seaplane fighter began in 1948. At the time, the US Navy was exploring a concept known as the mobile base, in which a family of seaplanes would operate from sheltered water, supported by naval vessels like landing ship docks. At the time, there remained doubts about whether supersonic aircraft could safely operate from a carrier deck. There were even brief doubts about the viability of large carriers at all, given the prospect of attack from jet bombers using nuclear weapons. The following year, the United States-class supercarriers were cancelled, increasing the need for an alternative arrangement to provide supersonic interceptors. Project Skate had advanced the field of seaplane jets in the US, but it had also demonstrated that a boat-hulled aircraft was effectively incompatible with supersonic performance. Aware of the NACA work on hydro skis, Project Skate morphed into Project Beta. The direction of Project Beta was also influenced by Convair's advanced work on delta wings. They had been developing the XP-92A demonstrator since 1946, and they flew it for the first time in July 1948. Shortly thereafter, and in parallel with their submissions for the Mobile Base Interceptor competition, they began to develop the aircraft that would ultimately become the F-102. There does appear, however, to have been at least some competition for the Navy's requirement, which firmed up in 1950. Apparently, Curtiss Wright submitted their own design study called the 565, but given that there's relatively little information about it to be found, I suspect that Convair's extensive experience meant that the field was rapidly reduced to one. There were no other companies really making seaplanes in the US by this point, with Martin being the notable exception. Convair were declared winners, and two initial XF prototypes and four YF follow-on prototypes were ordered on the 19th of January 1951. These aircraft's design started life in a 1948 study called Model 2. By 1951, the design had evolved into a futuristic tailless delta-winged fighter with its cockpit pushed right to the front of its rocket nose cone. The influence of the early Delta Dagger is plain to see, although in fact the Sea Dart flew 6 months before its much better known relative. In YF form, it was 51 feet long with a 35.25 foot wingspan that disguises a comparatively large 568 square foot wing area. As a package, it weighed a bit over 25,000 pounds at takeoff weight. Fuel capacity was small in the prototypes at only 1,000 gallons or so, but it would have been sufficient for point defense duties. Unfortunately, it also shared the fundamental aerodynamic flaws of the Deuce, in that it was designed before the area rule was known about, or rather before it was being applied to aircraft. If the Sea Dart had made it into production, the likelihood is that some form of area-ruled fuselage would have had to have been developed to take advantage of the other positive aspects of its design. When in the water, the aircraft floated with the trailing edge of the wings and the elevons level with the surface. The leading edge of the wing floated about 18 inches out of the water, which served to disguise the somewhat bulky lower fuselage that contained two retractable planing skis. The Sea Dart concept was a bit different than the earlier Squirt, in that it was an aircraft designed to be hangared and maintained on land, only being wheeled into the water down a jetty or the ramp of a dock ship when it was time to take off. To this end, the XF skis had wheels on the aft end, and there was a swiveling twin tail wheel to allow the aircraft to be steered. This was changed in the YF, the wheels being deleted. Beaching gear was then required to get the aircraft in and out of the water. Getting that gear on and off was a pain, but removing the wheels on the YFs was expedient for testing as it speeded up modifications to the skis. production aircraft would have had wheels. Testing with landing ship docks showed that it wasn't possible to get a Sea Dart aboard one under its own power, but it could be dragged in with lines. In general, the LSDs of the time were too small to safely operate the Sea Dart because the margin for error was too small and the impact of the aircraft's large wings on the ship's sides would have been catastrophic. But the idea was sound, and a larger ship would be able to operate the type successfully in and around a landing area. Getting into the Sea Dart on land required a large step up to the cockpit as the angled skis placed the aircraft nose high off the ground and there were no foot or handholds. The cockpit instruments were relatively simple and clear in the prototypes, but visibility out was pretty terrible. A production fighter would have needed a higher set canopy with more glazing and less structure to be viable. Power operation for the canopy would also have been needed. Because the Navy preferred twin-engine fighters to give a safety margin, the aircraft was powered by two Westinghouse J-46s, giving 6,100 pounds of thrust each in afterburner and 4,500 dry. Because these engines weren't available in time, the one and only XF that was finally produced initially used older J-34s with a modest 3,400 pound output. It received the J-46 in mid-1954 when its initial 140 test flights were completed. To prevent spray ingestion, the engines were in semi-flush nacelles on top of the fuselage with the intakes behind the pilot. Small additional air intake doors perforated the front section of the nacelles and could be activated by the pilot. The exhausts were recessed and were protected by pronounced fairings, sometimes referred to as sugar scoops in the literature. Reducing spray ingestion was important as the J-46 made extensive use of magnesium, which suffered from salt water corrosion. After every flight, they needed hosing with fresh water through the intakes. Deeper maintenance was a pleasingly old-fashioned affair, involving running the engine at idle while spraying in copious amounts of fresh water containing walnut shell fragments that served to knock the salt crystals off the turbine blades. Engines were started externally, either with a conventional APU on shore or a specially designed unit in a small boat when on the water. There was no way of restarting a stalled engine in flight, even if the other engine was on. The Navy was excited by the Sea Dart's potential and ordered a dozen production examples before the first prototype was completed. Taxi tests of the XF eventually began in December 1952 off San Diego, revealing that the aft end of the skis caused severe vibration as they hit the waves. This in turn impacted the ability of the pilot to concentrate or in fact even to hold the controls. It also broke off the nose probe, which was fared over at the time that the Sea Dart took its first flight on April 9, 1953. The ski design was the source of much experimentation throughout the long test program. The conclusion they reached was that a single large ski would be the best option, but this was only ever tested in fixed form on the XF. To take off, the pilot used the ski position switch on the left console to fully extend the ski. He then went to full military power. The ski would break the surface at about 8 or 10 knots, at which point the pilot moved it to the intermediate position and ignited the afterburner. The aircraft would naturally assume the right attitude until about 50 knots, when the ski needed moving back to the fully extended position again. From this point onwards, it was all about the pilot's skill in judging the wind and water conditions to get the nose at the right angle and the speed increasing consistently. Suddenly, at 125 knots, the aircraft would rotate to a nose-up attitude at about 17 degrees and it would be airborne. The ski could then be retracted. A good pilot could take off in about 25 seconds with a run of 2,300 feet. The book values were 38 seconds and 5,500 feet. JATO rockets could be fitted to the rear fuselage to reduce this still further. A landing could be accomplished in 1,700 feet and it needed the skis to be in the fully extended position. It's worth saying that an automatic system that controlled ski position based on airspeed was trialled, but was a potential death trap and was generally disconnected by the pilots. Flight testing went reasonably well overall, with the exception of continued issues with vibration during taxiing. On the 3rd of August 1954, Charles Richburg broke the sound barrier in a shallow dive in the first of the J-46-powered YF-2Ys, becoming the first person to travel faster than sound in a seaplane. Tragically, he was killed in a pilot-induced oscillation incident during a display of the mobile base concept in November 1954. This wasn't the first time that a pilot was caught out by the combination of transonic pitch-up and all-powered controls, and it really had nothing to do with the Sea Dart being a flying boat. Essentially, as Richburg attempted to fight the nose of the aircraft back down, the aerodynamic forces broke the wings off. The fighter exploded and he was killed. This very public accident in front of the watching press caused the program to be suspended. Although it did resume and flights continued through to 1957, the orders for production aircraft were cancelled. Supersonic aircraft on larger aircraft carriers were close to being delivered, and the need for the mobile base in general had receded. The Sea Darts were placed in storage, but were apparently still in the inventory in 1962 as they received the tri-service designation YF-7A. The Sea Dart was tantalizingly close to being a workable service seaplane jet fighter. If it had made it, then the intention was to arm it with a combination of 4 20mm M12 cannons and the obligatory 2 3/4-inch folding fin aircraft rockets. This being the Navy, people were far too sensible to insist on the Hughes Falcon. In 1955, after the Sea Dart order had been cancelled, Convair proposed an updated aircraft called F2Y2. This switched out the underwhelming J-46s, which had also been cancelled, for a single powerful J-57. The wing was switched with the wet wing from the updated F-102, doubling fuel capacity as well as improving transonic and supersonic aerodynamics. Performance was assessed to be in the Mach 1.3 range, but if fitted with a more powerful engine like the proposed Wright J67, then it could get to Mach 2. Weapons remain the same, but surely at some stage internal carriage of some form of radar-guided missile would have been considered. Proposed statistics are always a bit optimistic in terms of weight and power, but you can see how our production Sea Dart would have been useful in some niche tactical situations. But well, it just wasn't meant to be. Fortunately, the Sea Darts were preserved after the program ended, and you can see them on display in San Diego at the Smithsonian, the Florida Air Museum, and I believe also at Wings of Freedom in Pennsylvania. Before finishing the discussion on ski fighters, I should acknowledge that the concept of a ski-type planing surface was also known at Saunders Row. They began to experiment with scale models in November 1949. They don't appear to have tried a two-ski arrangement a la Sea Dart, instead going to a single long ski. Realizing this wouldn't work, they eventually arrived at a short, broad ski similar to the final concepts that Convair proposed. Saro's calculations suggested that such an arrangement would have half the weight of an equivalent landing gear. Their ideas came together in the 1953 P121, which was also capable of operating in open skis. It was a subsonic fighter with a high-mounted swept wing. The tactical concept was much the same as the Sea Dart. It would roll down into the water on small wheels from a hangar or a ship. When in the water, it floated with its wing-trailing edges resting on the water. The bulges on the wingtips contain extra skis for stability. The smooth underside of the fuselage also made it workable with the flexible carrier decks that were being tested at the time. The engine in this one was intended to be a 12,500 pound-force Sapphire. Armament was 4 30mm Aden cannons. All up, it would have been comparable in size to the Sea Dart, featuring a 51.5-foot long fuselage and just under a 40-foot wingspan. Wing area was 490 square feet. The total package weighed 22,000 pounds, and it would have been capable of hitting over 700 miles an hour with 16,000 foot per minute climb rate off a 750-meter takeoff run. Although seemingly quite well resolved, there was exactly no interest in P121, and no models were made, let alone a prototype. The whole endeavour ended in the early months of 1952. The French aviation industry was in dire straits after the end of the war, having essentially suspended operations during the most accelerated and extended aircraft development effort in history by everybody else. Post-war, the state-owned French companies were seemingly drunk on freedom, and they went off on numerous tangents without producing anything approximating an actual combat aircraft. Inevitably, boat fighters were amongst these avenues. Benefiting from reading post-war papers, but apparently not from any great practical experience, the X-101 had an unusual 25-degree swept wing mounted on top of the fuselage. The wings folded for storage aboard a seaplane carrier. In fact, the aircraft was intended to be capable of carrier or land launch using a catapult, or landing and takeoff on snow or waterlogged fields as well as calm water. They were not at all short of ambition. As proposed, X-101 had a landing skid under the fuselage to use as a shock absorber on landing. There's nothing in the project documents about using it as a planing surface, and no one in France seems to have been investigating hydroskis. Armament was contained in a removable nose-mounted pack that could contain either 4 20mm Hispano-Suiza cannons or unguided rockets for ground attack. SNK's calculations suggested a top speed of 560 miles per hour, which would have made it broadly equivalent to the later Dassault Ouragan. This seems highly unlikely, as X-101 had a large frontal area compared to a conventional jet fighter of the period. A year later, Latécourt, a pre-war seaplane manufacturer, offered the first of 3 aircraft that directly competed with X-101. The 270 was an ungainly proposal for a £12,000 fighter that betrays the lack of development the company had been able to do in the war years. Its boat hull is very prominent, leading to an almost comically unaerodynamic fuselage. The company were apparently most concerned with stability on takeoff and landing, as they also designed retractable wing floats rather than wingtip devices. They also invented a rotating spherical plug that blocked the front intake when taxiing. It was patented to prevent this piece of genius being copied. Amusingly, Latécourt were also against fitting intakes above the fuselage because it would block rear visibility. Having designed in this boon to situational awareness, they then fared in the cockpit ahead of a prominent dorsal spine. 270 was powered by a pair of Neens stacked one on top of the other and fed from the single intake. The 271 that followed it looked a bit more like a modern aircraft. The intakes moved above the cockpit, leaving a streamlined nose cone. Also significant was the replacement of the old-school seaplane double tail with a more conventional single fin. The horizontal tail was high to clear the jet blast. Drawings suggest that the stabilizing wing floats were gone now, replaced by a broader lower hull for stability. 271 led to the creatively named 272, which was a weird combination of a much sleeker fuselage of lower frontal area and a very forward-positioned cockpit, attached to the 270's pre-war seaplane tail and fixed wing floats. Armament was now 4 30mm cannons, and the intakes were in the wing roots. Shortly thereafter, development on these concepts fizzled out. But it resurfaced again in 1952 when SNK's produced a brochure aimed at the Air Force for a hydroavion interceptor Saunders. Their observation was very much in line with thinking in other militaries about the survivability of large airstrips in a major war. Their new project was firmly orientated towards interception. To this end, it had limited range and a high rate of climb to a high ceiling. Powered by an afterburning ATA 101F, it had a 31-foot span, 60-degree delta wing, and that was blended into the fuselage. Learning from the British experience with the Squirt, it had a nose-mounted intake, since spray ingestion was fine with this configuration. Armament was 4 30mm cannons in the wing roots now, with 100 rounds of ammunition per gun. The wings folded for use aboard carriers, and the rear fuselage was removable for ease of maintenance. In theory, the ISB could have been used from other soft surfaces as well as water, using a skid where required for landing. SNK claimed that the £13,000 40-foot-long aircraft weighed the same as an equivalent land plane, and they successfully tested its aerodynamic performance with a 1:15 scale model in a lake near Marseille. They then proposed a 1 to 2.5 scale model powered by a small Turbomeca Marbourg jet engine, but in December 1952 the French Air Ministry effectively killed the idea for good when they issued a note pointing out that waterways were not always available where they would be needed, that the infrastructure required for seaplane operations was not significantly less than for land based aircraft, and that the tactical management of seaplane fighters had not yet been mastered. Rough fields became the priority thereafter, leading to the experimental Barodur and later experiments with vertical takeoff fighters. The Soviet Union's experiences in the Second World War demonstrated to them the value of aircraft able to operate from unprepared surfaces, as the sheer scale of the Soviet Union meant that prepared strips were at a lower density than in other areas of the world. Inability of Soviet industry to develop full-deck aircraft carriers also meant that mobile defense of the fleet was more challenging than for a Western power should the Soviet Navy decide to come out from behind its bastion defense doctrine and operate somewhere else in the world. Since the Soviets had few international allies who possessed advanced airfield infrastructure, a boat fighter could also operate from a bay or a lake in Central Africa or somewhere similar and provide valuable air cover for marine or land-based operations. SAGI, the Central Aerodynamic and Hydrodynamic Institute, began a program in this direction during the early 1950s. This appears to have been similar to Project Skate in that it investigated a range of concepts through on-paper designs and a number of scale models. You can see some of these in the background. As with the US Air Force experiments on hydroskis, they also modified a piston engine flying boat to understand the practicalities of the technology. In this case, it was a Beriev B-8, and flight tests took place in 1955 and 1956. The final Soviet proposal for a water-based jet interceptor was a 28,000-pound radar-equipped supersonic aircraft armed with 2 air-to-air missiles and a pair of 23mm cannons. Powered by a single turbojet, it had a range of 1,300 miles and could accelerate to Mach 1.3 or 1.4. Takeoff and landing were accomplished on a single central ski with 2 stabilizers on the wingtips. The project went no further as the Soviet military were increasingly confident about the effectiveness of surface-to-air missile systems like the new S-75. It was more cost-effective to leave base and fleet defense to missiles than develop an entirely new and technically advanced product. Amazingly, the concept of a jet boat fighter appears to have had a very brief conceptual resurgence in 1982, when Lockheed dangled this tantalizing concept art. Called the Hydrostar, the combination of modern engines and flight control might well have led to an effective fighter. The lack of information on it probably means that it never made it beyond a Reagan-era doodle, or it went super black and it's out there somewhere. Jet-powered seaplane fighters turned out to be a good on-paper solution to the engineering challenge of building a supersonic fighter that could also operate from the water. This initially seemed like an impossible thing to do given the weight and size of supersonic aircraft combined with their inherent aerodynamic compromises. But angled decks and larger carriers helped to solve these issues alongside more powerful responsive engines, powered controls, and so on. Although the glut of large concrete runways left behind after the Second World War initially seemed to reduce the need for rough field-capable fighters, rapid development of fast bombers and the shadow of nuclear attack suggested significant vulnerabilities remained. And in some parts of the world, landing strips didn't exist at all. Being able to operate from lakes appeared to be a good solution until it was realized that sufficiently large surfaces were actually less available than they initially appeared. Vertical landing and takeoff concepts, which existed in some form at the same time, rapidly eclipsed the boat fighter in attention and funding. And then there was the strategic reality that committing to tactics built around a new idea like the boat fighter likely meant also committing to several generations of such aircraft. At the time, there were many new ideas to invest in, like guided cruise and ballistic missiles, airborne warning and control, defenses against nuclear submarines, electronic countermeasures, and so on. If all-out war had continued for another year, there's a decent chance we'd have seen a Saunders Road jet boat fighter in action. But as it was, the war ended, and with it the urgent need to fill every single niche tactical application as fast as possible. Still, personally, I feel it's a shame that I never got to experience the fury and the spectacle of a sea dart taking to the air in full afterburner. It must have been something else.